Before the packages, before the replacement queens, before the miticides and the foundation sheets and the plastic frames, there were beekeepers on the American frontier who kept colonies alive for decades with nothing but what they could cut from a forest and observe with their own eyes. Their winter losses were not zero. But in regions where modern operations lose 30, 40, 50% of colonies every winter, these families working without a single purchased input consistently wintered colonies that their neighbours could not match. Not in every year, not without loss, but with a consistency that becomes visible only when you look at the full span of what they were doing and why. 25 of those practices are still documented in regional agricultural records, extension reports, and the working diaries of frontier beekeepers from the Ohio Valley, the Appalachian foothills, and the Carolina Piedmont. Most of them have no commercial application. None of them require a catalogue order, and several of them have biological explanations that weren't fully articulated until the late 20th century, long after the practices themselves had been quietly set aside. If this kind of historically grounded approach to beekeeping is useful to you, a like on this video or a subscription goes a long way. It keeps this kind of content findable. Now, back to the frontier. There is one practice in this list that frontier beekeepers across Ohio, Kentucky, and the Carolinas defended every single spring to their neighbours. New settlers watched it and thought they were seeing a beekeeper make a mistake. They watched it year after year and couldn't understand why it kept being done. And the beekeepers who kept doing it didn't always have the language to explain it. They knew it worked. The full biological explanation of why it worked wasn't articulated until the second half of the 20th century. We'll get there. The first thing a frontier beekeeper did when moving to new land was not build a hive, it was find a bee tree. And finding one was not a matter of luck. It was a precise field skill with a specific method that frontier journals from the 1840s and 1850s document in careful detail. They called it beelining. On a warm afternoon when foraging was active, a beekeeper set out a small dish of comb honey or sugar solution in an open area and waited. When bees arrived and loaded up, he watched their departure angle, then walked in that direction several hundred yards and set the dish again. The bees would return, loading at the new position on the same radial line back to their tree. A third observation point triangulated the colony's location with enough accuracy that an experienced beeliner could find the cavity within a quarter-mile of the predicted intersection. The biology that made this work is the same directional constancy that governs the waggle dance. Inside the hive, a loaded forager returning to a high-value food source follows the same flight line on every trip. The beeliner was reading that constancy from the outside without needing to understand its internal mechanism. Once a bee tree was located, a frontier beekeeper did not immediately cut it. He observed it, the height of the entrance hole, its compass orientation, the diameter of the cavity, the degree to which the bees had sealed the entrance gap with propolis. All of these told him something about what kind of colony was inside, and whether it was worth the labour of moving. An entrance on the north face of a large tree, wide open and unpropolized in October, told one story. A tight south-facing knothole at chest height, heavily sealed and buzzing steady through the morning, told a very different one. That southern exposure was not a random preference. Frontier beekeepers documented it consistently enough that Ohio agricultural extension notes from the 1870s explicitly recommended positioning box hives with their entrances facing south or southeast. The biological reason is thermal. A south-facing entrance receives direct morning sun earlier in the day than a north or east-facing one. On cold late winter mornings, that difference in solar exposure is frequently the margin between cleansing flights and confinement. And cleansing flights in late February are the difference between a winter cluster that holds its population through March and one that begins losing bees to dysentery by the second week of the month. The log gum hive. A section of hollow log, capped top and bottom, fitted with simple crossbars for comb attachment, was not a primitive predecessor to the Langstroth box. It was a different thermal strategy. A log gum's walls, typically 4 to 8 inches of dense wood, provided a thermal mass that a 1-inch pine box does not approach. Research published in the International Journal of Biometeorology documented that standard Langstroth hives lose 4 to 7 times more heat than a typical tree cavity nest. The frontier beekeeper working with a log gum was not working with inferior equipment. He was working with a thermal performance profile closer to the environment in which honeybees evolved than anything that came after it. And here is the practice that confused the neighbours. A frontier beekeeper who transferred a new colony into a log gum in April did not harvest honey from that colony in the fall. Not a frame, not a cut comb section, nothing. He left every ounce of what the bees had produced and wintered the colony on its own stores. Neighbours who bought package bees and pulled frames in August thought this was timidity, or poor management, or a beekeeper who didn't understand that the bees always made more than they needed. They were wrong. But the full explanation of why requires understanding what the colony was actually building during that first season. And it was not only honey. In the first season inside a new cavity, a honeybee colony does not simply build comb and fill it with stores. It builds a specific architecture, a comb geometry, a cell size gradient, a brood nest positioning, calibrated to the thermal properties of that exact interior. The comb near the centre of the brood nest is constructed differently than comb at the periphery. Worker bees maintain temperature gradients across the comb structure that guide their own building decisions in real time. Interrupting that first season construction by pulling comb for harvest resets the architecture in ways that are not always recoverable before winter sets in. A colony left undisturbed through its first full season builds a comb structure that fits its cavity the way a hand fills a glove. That fit matters in February, when the cluster is generating approximately 40 watts of heat against whatever thermal environment surrounds it. Frontier beekeepers who wanted to expand their apiaries without purchasing bees captured swarms. But they did not capture every swarm in every season. The timing of the swarm determined its value. A swarm that issued in late April or early May in the Ohio Valley carried a young queen, a full forager population, and enough season ahead of it that the colony could establish comb, collect stores, and winter without supplemental feeding. A swarm that issued in late June or early July had none of those margins. Frontier diaries from the period document this as a working rule. Early swarms are worth housing, late ones are worth watching. The biology behind it is the same calculation that C.L. Farrar's 11-year study would later formalize. Demographic position at flow entry determines surplus production. An early swarm still has both the population and the season to work with. A late swarm has neither. When a frontier beekeeper lost a queen, to age, to a failed mating flight, to a rough inspection, he did not order a replacement. He gave the colony the conditions to raise its own. A frame of young open larvae placed correctly in a queenless colony allowed workers to initiate emergency queen cells from brood they had already begun feeding as workers. The process took 2 to 3 weeks longer than introducing a purchased mated queen, but the resulting queen was locally adapted, had completed her mating flights in the local drone pool, and was accepted by the colony without the introduction chemistry that a foreign queen requires. Frontier beekeepers did not understand queen mandibular pheromone, but they understood that a colony's own queen almost never triggered the defensive balling response that an introduced queen sometimes did, and they noticed something else about colonies that requeened naturally. The following spring, some of those colonies showed a different character, more settled, less inclined to build quickly toward the swarm threshold. Whether that was genetic selection or simply a colony that had restabilized around a queen the workers themselves had chosen, they couldn't say with certainty. But the pattern was consistent enough that experienced frontier beekeepers preferred the longer wait. Moses Quinby, writing in the 1860s, described what frontier beekeepers had already established as working practice. The entrance told you more than the frames, and faster. A colony that was queen-right, healthy, and ready to forage had a specific entrance pattern in the morning hours. Bees departing in a steady stream, pollen loads coming in, guard bees maintaining position. A queenless colony showed something different. A restless, directionless clustering at the entrance that looked busy but was not going anywhere productive. A colony building towards swarm showed a third pattern. Foragers accumulating at the entrance not because forage was poor, but because the interior had reached a congestion threshold that was suppressing the departure impulse. Frontier beekeepers made these distinctions before they ever reached for the hive tool. One thing frontier beekeepers did not do that modern beekeepers sometimes do is aggressively cull drone comb. The commercial logic against drones is straightforward. They consume stores without collecting, but frontier beekeepers observed that colonies with strong drone populations were also colonies that seemed to requeen successfully when the need arose. They didn't understand the mating biology. They were observing a real correlation. A colony contributing to the local drone pool, from which virgin queens mate during their flights, matters most in isolated apiaries with few colonies. Reducing that contribution compresses the genetic diversity of the mating pool in ways that sometimes show up in queen quality over several generations. If this kind of biology-first content is what you've been looking for, subscribing to this channel keeps more of it coming. There is more ahead in this video, and more in the library. Now, moving colonies, frontier beekeepers who relocated their colonies to new land, to better forage, to market, moved them at night, not because it was a tradition passed down without reason, because they learned, through lost colonies, what happens when you move a hive at dawn and leave foragers in the field with no hive to return to. A colony moved after dark carries its full population. Every forager that has been working that territory is inside the hive. They are disoriented by the move, but they are present. They reorient from the new location the following morning and begin calibrating their flight patterns to the new terrain. A colony moved at mid-morning loses every forager currently in the field. Those bees return to empty air, cluster at the site of the former hive, and either die or drift to a neighbouring colony. A colony that arrived at its new location already short a third of its foraging force was starting from a deficit that took 2 to 3 brood cycles to recover from. For transport on wagons over rough terrain, frontier beekeepers wrapped log gums and box hives in wet burlap. This was not insulation, it was ventilation management. A colony in transit cannot fan moisture effectively. Heat and carbon dioxide accumulate. Wet burlap slowed heat buildup and maintained surface humidity around the hive entrance, enough to prevent suffocation events that killed confined colonies on hot days. Ohio extension records from the 1880s document cases where improperly vented colonies arrived dead after moves of less than 10 miles in summer. The wet burlap method was a practical solution to a biological problem they understood empirically. Confined colonies in heat overheat, and surface moisture slows the process. After a colony was moved, frontier beekeepers did not simply set the hive down and walk away. They placed a leafy branch in front of the entrance, a deliberate disruption of the visual field. This caused foragers emerging for their first flights from the new location to slow down and execute a broader, more careful orientation pattern before committing to a forager route. A bare entrance after a move allowed overconfident foragers to depart on direct line flights, still calibrated to the old location. The branch forced more thorough orientation. Modern research has confirmed the underlying behavior. Disruption of the entrance environment after a move triggers more complete reorientation flights. The frontier beekeeper arrived at the same conclusion through watching how many bees didn't come back without it. Frontier beekeepers burned what the land provided, but over seasons they noted that not all smoke performed the same. Rotted wood punk, dry, partially decayed wood that caught slowly and held a coal, produced a cool, dense smoke that settled into the hive without heat. Green grass produced a wetter, cooler smoke that moved bees away from the entrance without triggering the sharp defensive alarm that hot, thin smoke sometimes caused. Dried cattle dung, common in frontier regions where timber was scarce, burned with a cool density similar to punk. What these beekeepers were managing without the vocabulary to describe it was the difference between smoke that masked alarm pheromone and calmed defensive response, and smoke that simply added heat and agitation. Cool, dense, and slow, that was the working standard, and experienced frontier beekeepers used a colony's response to smoke as a diagnostic. A colony that retreated calmly and began engorging on honey stores, the behavior that signals a swarm impulse triggered by smoke, was a queen-right colony in normal defensive posture. A colony that did not respond to smoke in the expected way, that showed continued agitation or an absence of the characteristic sound change that accompanies a calm smoke application, that was a colony worth examining carefully before proceeding. Queenless colonies, colonies under nutritional stress, and colonies carrying high mite loads sometimes showed atypical smoke responses. Frontier beekeepers read that response as a signal before they opened anything. Now here is where the log gum architecture, the first season comb construction, and the propolis envelope come together. These three elements working independently, each provided a measurable thermal or biological benefit. Working together, in a colony that had been given one uninterrupted season to build its interior geometry, they created a winter environment that a standard Langstroth hive with top ventilation and thin pine walls has never replicated without deliberate modern intervention. The log gum's thermal mass held overnight temperatures inside the cavity several degrees warmer than outside air. The comb architecture, built without disturbance over a full season, was calibrated to the thermal properties of that specific interior. The brood cluster positioned where heat retention was best, peripheral honey stores serving as additional insulation at the colony edges, and the propolis envelope, the layer with which honeybees coat the interior of any cavity they occupy, was fully developed by the end of the first season in a way that it is simply not developed at the end of a single spring installation in fresh equipment. Propolis has documented antimicrobial properties. A fully propolized interior reduces pathogen load. It also reduces gaps and air movement through the cavity walls. The frontier beekeeper who left his first-year colony entirely alone through the fall was not being passive. He was allowing all three of these processes to complete on their own schedule. A colony entering its first winter in a log gum with undisturbed comb architecture, a fully developed propolis interior, and its full honey stores intact, was a colony that had been given everything it needed to maintain a functional winter cluster at the lowest possible metabolic cost. That is what the neighbours thought was timidity. That is what the biology has since confirmed was precision management, performed by doing less, not more. And now the first year no harvest practice makes complete biological sense, because it was never simply about leaving extra honey. It was about not disturbing the things that the honey was part of. The full explanation comes down to three things happening in the same uninterrupted season. The comb architecture was settling into the thermal geometry of the cavity. The propolis envelope was developing its full antimicrobial and insulating coverage across the walls and sealing every unnecessary gap. And the winter bees produced in late August and September of that first year were developing in a colony that had not been nutritionally depleted by a beekeeper pulling frames in August. The vitellogenin concentrations in those first season winter bees, the glycolipoprotein that functions as a physiological longevity switch in cold weather worker bees, depended on adequate pollen stores and an undisturbed nutritional environment during their nurse phase. Pull honey from a first-year colony in August, and you redirect nurse bee energy away from fat body accumulation. The winter bees that emerge from a nutritionally compressed first-year colony are physiologically shorter-lived than they needed to be. Frontier beekeepers did not know vitellogenin, but they knew that first-year colonies left entirely alone wintered better than first-year colonies that had been opened repeatedly and partially harvested. They observed the outcome. The mechanism waited a century and a half to be named. When a colony was wintering in a fixed location in cold country, frontier beekeepers often banked the hive, mounded earth against the exterior walls to a height of 6 to 8 inches around the lower hive body. This earth berm added thermal mass at the level where the winter cluster typically positioned itself. It also eliminated the convective airflow that moves along the outside of hive walls on windy winter nights, pulling heat through conduction from the cavity interior. Modern research on hive thermal dynamics confirms that exterior insulation applied at the cluster level reduces heat loss more effectively than an equivalent amount of insulation added above the cluster. Frontier beekeepers reached the same conclusion through the observation that banked colonies used less honey and emerged stronger in April. They also reduced their hive entrances to a single bee width opening in late October, sometimes earlier, not only because of mice, though mice wintering inside a hive were a real problem, but because a large entrance in cold weather creates an air column that runs through the hive interior and forces the cluster to work against convective heat loss continuously. A reduced entrance slows air exchange without eliminating it. The colony can still ventilate, but the bees are not managing a cold air channel through the center of the cavity during the weeks when the cluster's thermal reserves are at their lowest. Frontier beekeepers who located bee trees to harvest also noticed a consistent pattern in the older ones. Cavities that had been occupied for 3 or more years had interior walls coated in a dense, dark, unbroken propolis layer. Cavities in their first occupied winter showed less complete coverage, and cavities that had been repeatedly accessed, trees that honey hunters had found and robbed annually, showed irregular patchy propolis application wherever the interior had been disturbed. The more intact the propolis envelope, the more the colony had been left alone, and the colonies with the most intact envelopes were consistently the ones still occupying the same tree when the beeliner returned the following year. The longest-lived frontier colonies were not the most productive ones. They were the most left alone ones. That is an observation without a commercial application, which may be exactly why it was not carried forward. Before the season opened, experienced frontier beekeepers in new territory walked the land, not to find bee trees, to find the bloom sequence. They identified which species flowered first, which overlapped, where the major forage sources fell relative to the apiary, and how many weeks separated the peak of one source from the next. This bloom calendar was not written down in most cases, it was memorized, and it governed every management decision from the timing of splits to the harvest schedule. A beekeeper who knew that the locust bloom peaked 3 weeks before the clover, and that a 2-week dearth followed, managed those 3 weeks differently than one who did not. The bloom calendar was the management calendar. Frontier beekeepers also assessed their winter colony's provision level without scales. They used their hands. Tilting a log gum or a box hive slightly from the rear gave a rough but practical sense of its weight. A colony with adequate winter stores had a specific resistance when lifted at the back. A colony that tilted too easily was a colony that would need attention before February. A frontier beekeeper who had wintered 40 colonies across 15 seasons had calibrated that sense against observed outcomes to a degree that was practically reliable. Not precise by instrument standards, reliable by experience. When a frontier beekeeper finally harvested, in the second fall of a colony's life in an established log gum, the frames he pulled often outweighed what his neighbours had been pulling from first-year colonies in the same season. A second-year colony with established comb architecture and a fully propolized interior had a larger effective brood nest, a more efficient nurse-to-forager ratio during the primary flow, and a queen laying at the peak of her productive life. The restraint of the first year produced a second-year colony that was, in biological terms, a more capable production unit than anything a first-year startup could be on paper. The frontier beekeeper's arithmetic was not seasonal, it was generational. Frontier honey was currency. In communities where cash money was scarce, A pound of well-cured honey traded against butter, salt, grain, and labour at known rates. But not all honey traded at the same value. Water content determined shelf life. Honey extracted before the cells were fully capped, what modern beekeepers call wet honey, fermented in storage and was worth less at trade, sometimes worthless. Frontier beekeepers who wanted reliable barter value harvested only fully sealed frames, or applied the inversion test, a frame tilted horizontal over a container. If honey ran freely, it was not ready. If it held in the cells, it was. No refractometer required. The test had been accurate enough for generations. Most frontier honey moved not as extracted liquid, but as cut comb, sections of sealed honeycomb wrapped in cloth. Cut comb preserved itself in ways that open liquid honey did not. The wax capping prevented oxidation and moisture absorption. The honey inside held at its natural water content, and cut comb carried its own quality signal. The full cap was visible to the buyer. A buyer could see what he was purchasing. In a pre-centrifuge economy, cut comb was not a specialty product. It was the standard form in which honey moved through the frontier market. There is a final observation in the frontier beekeeping record that does not fit neatly into any management category. Beeliners who returned to the same territory season after season noted that some bee trees, left completely undisturbed and never harvested, remained occupied continuously for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. Not by the same colony. Honeybee colonies do not live 40 years. What persisted was the location. New swarms, season after season, moved into the same cavity. The cavity had been shaped by previous occupants. The comb architecture already existed. The propolis envelope was already developed. The thermal geometry had already proven itself through multiple winters. A swarm moving into a well-occupied bee tree did not have to build a functional winter environment from scratch. It moved into one. The bee tree was not simply a source of honey. Left intact, it was a living accumulation of everything honeybee colonies do when given enough time and enough space to solve their own problems. Frontier beekeepers who understood this hunted bee trees for colonies, not for honey. The colonies they moved from those established trees, they knew from experience, often performed better in their first winter than any package ever had. These 25 practices did not survive because they were documented in textbooks. Most of them did not survive in any systematic form. They persisted in the working habits of individual beekeepers who learnt them from the generation before and passed them to the generation after, when they found someone patient enough to listen. The biology behind most of them is now documented in research that the frontier beekeepers never read and never needed to read. They reached the same conclusions through a slower and quieter method. Observation, season after season, colony after colony, winter after winter. There is still something to learn from that method. Not because it was better than modern science, but because it was asking the same question from a different direction. Not what can I add to help this colony, but what can I stop doing long enough to let this colony help itself? If you have used any of these practices in your own apiary, or if you have ever found a bee tree and made the decision to leave it alone, I would be genuinely interested to hear about it in the comments below. A like on this video helps it reach beekeepers who may not have come across this kind of historical approach before. There is more in this channel that takes the same direction. Biology first, history second, product list nowhere.